All right, so welcome everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to part 2 of our SPARK.grow webinar series. My name is Phil Santer, and I'm SVP of Business Development at Ann Arbor Spark. For those of you not familiar, Spark is a public-private partnership that is focused on identifying and meeting the needs of businesses at every stage. And it's under that approach that we developed this 2-part webinar that we're calling SPARK.grow. For the past couple of years, we've had a Spark.ed series focused on early stage company development, but we wanted to dig into topics that are critical to companies looking to grow, scale, and maintain their businesses, and developed in partnership with Dave Haviland this 2-part series. And this particular webinar that you're listening to is part 2 on developing future leaders to reach their potential. We know that talent development is critical to the success of any company, and even more critical given the, talent landscape that we are in today. So we're excited to share this topic with you. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you the founder of Phimation, Dave Haviland, who is a management consultant to Stage 2 businesses and helps clarify business goals and strategies. He's been doing management consulting for many years and has a history of leading companies to scale. He's also someone that we've worked with at Spark over the past several years. So I'm going to turn it over to Dave now, but note that you will have a chance to ask questions during the course of the webinar. If you notice in your screen, there's an area that you can ask a question. I think it says to staff. So if you do have a question, please feel free to write in there and send it on, and we will get to those as we go through the webinar. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dave to take it away.
All right, thanks, Phil. So thank you for joining us for this second in the series. When we discussed designing these webinars, Phil and I, we talked about making it relevant both to current leaders who have the responsibility of developing future leaders, and also to the future leaders themselves, those rising managers who are looking to grow their careers. And so we'll cover some content that's better for current leaders, some for future leaders, and I think in both of those views there will be useful things for all parties. Let me just start with a little background about me in case you didn't join on our last one. I work with about 20 different clients, and I get to work across the whole spectrum of the business. If you think about what a board of directors is responsible for, chief operating officer, that's kind of the realm that I'm operating in. Different levels, different types of projects, different initiatives. So I am exposed to issues across all of that. The high potential future leader issue is one that has come up in front of my clients as we look at investing in talent development, and it seemed like a natural fit as Phil and I talked about the kinds of issues that he's talking to companies about too. I used to have a slide that showed the logos of my clients, but nobody really knows them, but you do know the companies that my clients sell into. So we're required to operate at a very high level from our internal processes and also from the way that we serve and approach our customer relationships. And then the content that we're going to be talking about today has been developed from my work with about 30 future leaders, 25 to 35-year-olds who are rising in their careers, and then about 20 to 25 current leaders in different businesses as we've tried to figure out how we can best serve those rising leaders. So it's coming out of a broad base of companies and experiences with a range of different people. So let me just review. In the first webinar, we talked about what is high potential, and then a view of the high potential talent and defining that, and then also high potential positions if you are somebody that's looking at different opportunities and trying to evaluate what the best one would be. So let me just do a quick review of that. This is a model that I use with my clients to assess our portfolio of people, portfolio of talent. And of course, we're focused in on the upper right box as we talk about high potentials here. Just if you didn't see this model the last time, current performance and how well they're doing currently is on the y-axis, and then future potential is on the x-axis. And depending on where somebody falls, you would use different techniques to manage them. And the techniques that we're talking about here are the ones for the upper right box. So in looking at high potential talent, there's a stack of 6 different categories of things that a high potential person has to do and do well in order to qualify and also to fulfill and work on fulfilling that potential. The first bottom 3, the ones in blue, are relevant for any job. You don't necessarily need to be in any one department or any different position in the company if they're relevant across. And that's performing in the work that you need to do, recognizing how value is created and focusing on value creation, and then having a learning attitude and learning practices. So that's relevant across any position. Then the ones in green are relevant for people that enter into the leadership space of the company. So if you want to be a leader that's kind of looking across the company and looking outside of your own department, these are the kinds of things that you need to bring. One is investment thinking and having an ROI approach to the decisions that you make, certain level of maturity in how you approach your job and personal relationships. And then there are leadership skills like being able to have insight and foresight and also making effective decisions that are important to play at that leadership level. And so in the first webinar, we talked about 3 components of each of these different layers. So if you're wondering what the details are, then you can go back into that recording of the first webinar and see more detail around this model. So that's looking at the people. If we look at the positions, then if you're a high potential person and saying, which position should I go to? How can I look for positions that are going to develop me better? Then these are the things that I would recommend that you look for. The blue are ones that should be in place no matter what position you're going for. And one is just a positive environment. That means that there are resources available and that the business is healthy. The other is support. So support for your development. There are a number of companies that have a positive business environment and have good potential, but they don't also offer the active support for the efforts that you would have for developing your career. So both of those are important. And then the items in green are ones where you can pick and choose. Different positions will have different profiles of how you could grow and the kind of potential that you can develop in them. So you could orient around growth and covering a broader base or learning new things in different directions from where your skill set is now. You could increase the impact that you have and play in an important or bigger space than you are currently. And then you can increase the exposure that you have. Your network is important to your potential in your career. And so just having exposure to more people and being able to interact with more people is valuable too. So the blue are things that you'd want no matter what, and the green is you'd want to select which of those is important to you or which of those is available in any position and think about whether that's a good fit for you. All right, so that's the review of last webinar. For today, I want to start with the business case because there is a question of how should we invest in this space, how much should we invest in high potentials, and there are some risks and challenges that go along with it. So we want to be aware of those and be conscientious about it as we think about how much and how to invest. And then I want to share a couple of general development frameworks that you can use and finish by talking more specifically about programs and what I typically see for high potential development and future leader development. Before I get into that, I will say that my model for working with boards of directors or for other executives is to provide general models and general frameworks that help to think about the issue and come up with a way of understanding what's at play. But then there's a lot of interpretation and use that needs to happen to apply it to your particular situation. So this is not a paint by numbers kind of set of tools that you can use and just take and apply it the same way to everybody. These should help you think in broad terms about the opportunity and how to approach it, but then there's going to have to be discussion and customization for your particular situation. The good news is that you all as current leaders and the future leaders that you're talking with are, you're sophisticated, you're on the more sophisticated side, and so you should be able to work with these models and take them and apply them. That's why this model of tools works well with the clients that I work with. All right, so any business case starts with the need or the opportunity, and this is a slide I just grabbed from our first webinar. Of course, these are the people that do a lot of work. They have good relationships with customers. They have a good impact internally on morale and culture. And so the need and the opportunity for the business case is usually pretty clear around high potential leaders because their impact is so big in so many different areas. The other part that I see, so I look at probably 100 to 150 business cases every year around some kind of strategic investment that a company wants to make. And the biggest areas of weakness in those are representing the impact that an investment will have, so the return that you get out of your investment, and also the challenges and risks. So I wanted to focus in on that in particular as we talk about the business case. So again, there are these three areas that we'll look at: the impact of investing in development programs for future leaders, and then the challenges and risks. On the impact side, there are four areas to look at. The first is they'll improve operational productivity, expand the market and customer footprint, improve the ROI that you'll get on a strategic project or an investment that you're making, and then there'll be reduced cost of having to replace somebody. So the retention is actually a benefit by a foregone cost that you would have had to have otherwise. And just to give you a ballpark for what I've seen on all of these, this is looking at the bell curve and kind of the center of the bell curve. I've seen outliers that are dramatically better than this. I haven't seen many that are dramatically worse than this. This is pretty typical once you're into the future leader high potential space. So operational productivity, if you put the high potential leader in the right place, they can easily have a 1% to 2% improvement on the overall expense base of the company as a whole. I've seen that as high as probably 10% of the entire company's expense base. So it can be significant. Market and customer expansion, if you're talking about your core customers and putting them on a key account that might already have $100,000 in revenue or $500,000 in revenue, you could typically see a 1% to 10% improvement. 1% isn't that great unless it was stagnant before. But I've seen that as high as 50%. And then if you're putting them on a new account, the best example, best scenario that I've seen is an account that started around $20,000 and grew up to like $250,000. So they can have a huge impact by selling new and by getting a new customer. But typically, you can see a high potential starting to participate in the sales process and marketing process. Will be able to increase revenue from new customers as a total around 5 to 25%. For a particular project, strategic project that you have, if you put a high potential on that, you can increase the ROI somewhere between 10 and 30%. When I was raising venture capital, the VCs would say, I'd always rather have an A team with a B idea than a B team with an A idea. And they'd say the A team will always figure out how to make it work, and the B team will always screw up even a good idea. So high potentials can have a significant impact on a strategic project that you have, and I think 10 to 30% is a reasonable estimate. And then finally, by retaining this talent, you don't have the cost of replacing them and the recruiting expenses that are associated with that. I think most recruiting expenses, if you have a recruiter, and if you that's 20, 25%. Even if you don't, that's what you're going to spend in the amount of time that your staff is going to take. So I ballparked it at 50% of their salary that you are saving by not having to recruit a replacement. But of course, if this is an A-level person, the likelihood of replacing them with an A-level person is not great. It's not terrible, but it's not. You can't take it for granted. So if you were to replace them with a B-level person, then all of the things above play in too. So the retention of them needs to also be tied to what would it be like if we had just a normal performer there. So these folks have a significant impact on the business, and that can be quantified in real dollars that can justify $5,000, $10,000, $50,000 to spend on their development. There are challenges, though, that are associated with this. The first one is these are highly productive people in the most important areas in the business. And so taking them away from their actual job to do some training, it creates problems in the company to get the work done. You can work around that by shortening up the amount of time that they're gone and things like that. But it's just the reason that I see people not doing programs for high potentials is that they can't imagine taking them out of the actual productive role that they have. So that's one, but manageable. Also, high potentials are hard to develop because they set the bar high. They have a high amount of training that they can go through, and because they're more sophisticated, it's got to be pretty high quality. So you can't just throw them into a Fred Pryor or some kind of basic training. They'll get through that. You can do that once or twice, but then they'll get through that material pretty quickly and still be looking for more. And that creates a challenge for us as we try to develop them. I've seen situations where the current leadership was never trained, and that can present two problems. The first is they don't know what to train other people on because they've never had that exposure, and also they can, be a little jealous or be uncertain about how this is going to undermine their role. And so, one recommendation that I would have is I've done training where we include the current leaders and future leaders all together. And the rationale for that is that we want everybody to be on the same page and to have the current leaders know what the future leaders went through. That's the outward message. What we knew when we were doing it that way was that we needed to do some reinforcement training for our current leadership also while we were doing that. You can also create a situation where the rising leaders are actually better trained in some areas than the current leaders, and they can get really frustrated if the current leaders have kind of backward thinking or are not up on the thinking that they should be doing. They'll get the high potentials will get frustrated. And then just to reiterate the point that I made before, high potentials work through general training really quickly, and then they need custom coaching, and that's just a harder thing to do. It's easier to do canned training. It's much harder to find somebody that has trustworthy judgment that you want to have them be like helping them through the decisions that they need to make. And so finding coaching is much harder than finding training. It's not impossible, and there are lots of good coaches out there, but it's a different buy from a talent development perspective. On top of those challenges, there are also risks. One risk is that the high potentials will leave, and especially if they're younger than 25, there's somewhat of a likelihood that they'll leave. So how do we plan for that, and how do we mitigate that risk as we develop the programs? They also could become a competitor. This is especially the case if you're in a services business and you train them up in your service, and then they can just open another shop that's down the street that does something similar, or they'll go and jump to a competitor and bring all that training that they had, probably get a higher salary, and then also bring it into their customer, to your competitor. Again, that can be managed, but it's a concern that we have to be aware of and make sure that we do manage. As future leaders rise, you have to backfill their old positions, and as we said, they can be highly productive employees, and so it can be harder, and you can have a letdown as you move a high potential out of their current role and into another role. You have to be aware that there's going to be likely to be a letdown in how that former role is done. And then lastly, other staff can get jealous, and that is especially true if you have an environment where relationships are more important than performance. So there are a number of companies that I work with that are more family businesses, or they feel like family. And another way of thinking about those businesses is that relationships are as important or more important than performance is. If you're in that kind of environment, you have to be sensitive to the fact that people may not understand why high potentials are getting extra attention and they're not. And so you have to, you may need to do extra explaining about the difference in performance and the difference in potential. I see that as a positive. I think that's a good conversation to have within a business, but it may be different than other conversations that you've had in the past. All right, so all this is to set the landscape of saying, should we invest? The programs that we're going to look at involve extra investment from the company into a future leader. And there's other uses of money that we could be looking at. There's also just a question of whether that's the right thing to be doing with those leaders. And so we need to keep in mind this business case and these thoughts about the impact and the risks as we look at the programs, because on balance, the programs that we're going to look at are somewhere between a $5,000 and maybe a $50,000 investment overall, depending on the size of your business. And I would argue, on balance, with all these things that we're looking at on these pages, that it's worth it. But it's not a slam dunk, and it's something that you should evaluate. And there are ways that you can manage the programs to be more elaborate or less elaborate, depending on your risk profile and the amount of money you have to invest. All right, so the first model that I want to work from is a career map. I think it's important to communicate to high potentials as they come into your business as a recruiting tool, and then also as a retention tool, that you have an idea of how you want their career to map out, and that there is a future and the ladder that they can climb. Many, many, many people are looking for that in young talent now, and so we have to respond to that. And this is just like a general framework that you can use to have a conversation with the people that are interested in that career map. And on the y-axis is role. That's the equivalent of like their vertical role in the company. So how are they progressing up the ladder? The function is more of a horizontal view of what are the different areas that they're participating in. So a career map is really about how horizontally and vertically you want to progress through the company. So let's look at each of these. On the role side, I think of 4 different levels: the technical, management, strategy, and leadership. An explanation of what those are is the technical part is just doing the work that needs to be done. Management is really about ensuring that the work gets done, or ensuring that the company or that department performs to the level that it should. Strategy then looks forward some, and it's about directing the department forward and also planning where that direction is. And then lastly, leadership is about ownership and overseeing. So you're not really involved in the work actually getting done. You're overseeing it, and then also taking responsibility for the results and for making sure things happen that need to happen. On the function side, these are general terms because this could work for somebody in the software development department or the sales team or the finance team. So we're just using general terms here, but if you were using this kind of career map with somebody, you would probably want to put specific functions to them where these words are. But we'll talk about core function, and then adjacent function is next to core but related, but different enough that it's separate. Complementary is the next level out, where there's still some connection to that core function that you're serving, but it's starting to get into a realm that's different. I think of the difference between sales and marketing. Sales and marketing are really 2 different disciplines, but they're highly related and have a lot of overlap to how they get their work done. And then finally, supplementary is the other functions in a business. And because they're in the same business, they're related. But besides that, they're really separate. So sales and finance, software development, and marketing. Those are far enough apart that they're not really closely related. So what might this look like? A first example would be a core might be doing research analysis. Adjacent to that would be sales, so selling those research projects. Adjacent to that and into the complementary sector is project management. And then the supplement of that might be HR, where you're responsible for building up other research analysts or other people on the team. So that's one example of how functions can stretch out. Another example is you could have a software developer as the core functionality, and then once that developer has coded for a while, you might use him or her in a customer project. Still maybe somewhat related to coding, but also you're going to expose them to customer relations and things like that. A next step beyond that would be customer service, where now there's some technical component, but there's a heavy component of that customer interaction. And then finally, sales. Sales, if you start at software development and coding, sales is really not that related. And so that would be in the supplementary. So the particular functions that you would be talking about with a future leader would, you'd have to decide what that is, but that's part of the point of this framework, is to have that conversation and to think about, well, what would those possibilities be and what would the best ones be for this person? So you can put all of this onto a grid, and that grid then becomes the career map, and you can talk about what the y-axis and the x-axis items should be for a particular person. Usually, if I was working with this, talking to a person about their progression, I would then put a year or a quarter, some kind of time frame in where I saw them developing and what the path would be. Are we stretching up first from, basically everybody starts in the lower left of doing your core functionality that you're hired for. From there, are you going up or are you going sideways? Where do you want to head from there? To show you what that looks like and how that could progress, you have the one, of course, in the lower left. That's step number one in their career progression. Then this one goes up first into more of a management role, and then down to the doing of the adjacent function. And then up again, number 4 goes back up into strategy. So this one is really about the person becoming a leader within the group and then stretching that leadership. As you look at 5, 6, 7, 8, that's stretching the leadership and their role out across the organization into complementary, adjacent and complementary functions. And the point that I'd make here about leadership roles is they're not really tied to a particular function. They're more about the company as a whole. And so I would distinguish those. The progression under that of technical management and strategy is really tied to a role that they're playing. Jumping up into the leadership is about being part of a leadership team and serving a role as a team member looking across the whole company. Just to give you an idea of how this can play out differently, these are the same numbers. I just made them smaller and faded them a little so that they step back. And if that one was more about having the person go up within a function first, this one would be about having the person go sideways into other functions, a more horizontal. So you see 1 and 2 then are going sideways. 3 is getting a management function within the core function, within their first functionality. And then 4 is stretching out again to even a broader view of the company and being involved in other activities. And I won't go through the rest, but if you look at how these play out, generally 1, 2, 3, and 4, a typical progression for a future leader would be to stay within the green on this slide. So they're going to stay within their functionality that they started with and just become a leader within that. If they're good, then they'll go into the blue boxes here. And if they're really good, they'll get into the gray. And depending on our development programs, we can take people that might only be in green on their own and stretch them into the blue areas. Or we can take people that would naturally just be in the blue and stretch them into the gray areas. So the ROI, the purpose of our development programs, is to get people to kind of have more potential, broader, higher and broader in the organization than they would have otherwise. But typically, you'll see most people, most of your high potentials will just fulfill the green. That's maybe half or 2/3 of them will be in that sector. And then of the remaining third or half that you have, maybe half of those, probably 2/3 of those will stay within the blue area. And so then only 1/3 would actually move into this really broad scope of impact on the business. To say that another way, most of typical profile of a high potential is going to fall in this area. But there are some, and as they get involved in other areas in the business, not really going to be in a management or a leadership role, more just leading and managing within their own function. But there are some profiles, there are some leaders that are able to start in their core functionality, get up to a management level, and then they're just really good at managing and strategy and looking forward and working with people. And part of your job as a leader is to recognize, are we dealing with this kind of typical profile of somebody that's just good within their core function, or do we have somebody that can really stretch out across the organization? All right, so that is the model that as a company I would use to have a conversation about a career path for a future leader. And I also have worked with the leaders, the future leaders themselves, on a personal growth model to say, if your company doesn't do anything, what would I recommend that you do, and how do I recommend that you approach your career as somebody that's just constantly going to be interested in growing their influence and growing the impact and growing, the role that you have in a business. So in this model, there are two dimensions that we work off of. The first is developing your character and tapping into soft skills within your character. And then the second are the skills that are involved to actually do whatever work it is or do whatever function that you have, the coding itself, the sales, the marketing, engineering, or management and strategy, strategic planning, things like that. So let's start by looking at the progression. There are 4 levels that you can manage or should manage when you have this growth model. The first is what you already know. So these are things that you're already good at. And from a growth perspective, we want to be developing in all these different areas. Second is then what you're learning. So these are areas that you've already identified. This is something I'm interested in. I'm taking an active approach to building my skills and building my knowledge. Outside of that, the next horizon are things that you know that you don't know, but that you might want to learn at some point. So you're aware of them, but you just don't have time or interest at this point to learn them. And then, of course, the last horizon beyond that is what you don't know you don't know. So these are things that you will know in a year or 5 years, but you don't know them yet. And so the question is, how do you take an active approach to managing all 4 of these horizons to be growing your influence and growing your impact and growing as a person, your capabilities. Feeding into all this model is first of all, self-awareness. So just being aware of who you are and how you are and what your strengths and limitations are. We all have those. And the important thing is us recognizing what they are and then thinking about what we want to do about them. The second is your vision for the future and your career model. Where do you want to go? What's going to be important? Where do you want to head? Those are going to influence which of the things that you could learn are the ones that you're actually going to want to learn. Because we all have, 10,000 different things that we could get better at, but there's a much smaller set that matter to us. And so that vision or career model is going to be helpful to weed that stuff out. And then finally, an ownership attitude says, I'm responsible for making sure that I develop. I'm not looking to my boss or to the company to do this. I'm going to take responsibility for making sure that I'm constantly growing. So then we say, how do we access these different horizons? And on the character side, there are skills, soft skills that you need for each one of these horizons. So for getting better at what you know, what I see most often is that the people who are doing that, who are taking an active approach to learning within that, they're doing that from a place of ownership. So they care about the results that they're getting. And because they care about the results, then they're asking questions about how they can get better. And so taking an owner, if you don't care about the results, then there's not really a reason to get better. So I think ownership is and what taking ownership means is the most important part of the character development in that first horizon. For what you're learning, that's just being curious and making sure that you're asking questions and staying, curious about what's happening and what could be learned from the things that you are learning. A curious person will probably be able to, A, get 25% more out of the same training class than a non-curious person just because they're thinking about it more, or B, be able to carry a skill training longer than somebody else because they just keep asking questions about how things work or what happens. So curiosity is important for the second horizon. For the third horizon, empathy, in order to think that there are things that you don't know and to acknowledge that there are things that you don't know, you have to be able to see the world from eyes that are different than yours. And that is what empathy is all about. And then finally, for the last horizon, where it's things that you don't know, the most important character trait for that is humility It's understanding that we just don't have all the answers and that we have to come at the world from that place. And when we do, we'll discover things that are there that we didn't even realize were there before. I'm a Brene Brown fan. She talks about the value of vulnerability and how important that is for growth and creativity and innovation and things like that. And so across all of these, I would also put vulnerability and then the antidote to vulnerability, which is courage. Those are important across all of those horizons as a way to access a broader view of the world and broader skills within the world. So those are the soft skills that you need to bring to these development horizons. Let's talk about more practically how to develop the hard skills that are involved here. So if you're dealing and getting better in what you already know, then I think there's expert training. So there's introductory or skill training, which is about how do you at a basic level do what you need to do. Expert training is tapping into somebody who's done it for 15, 20, 25 years and really can teach you about the nuances of how to do things, tools, perspectives that you have enough knowledge already to know how to use them. Also, because it's about taking ownership of the result, then there are retrospectives or reviews of what happened where you can learn how to do things differently. And then finally, benchmarking is a way that you can look at an independent or objective view of how other people do it and evaluate how you're doing it. So those are the three modes that I think are useful for that first horizon. For what you're learning, before you get to expert training, there's more skill training, which is how do you do the work? And that can be a 101 level, a 201 level, a 301 level. So there are different levels of just doing whatever skill you have, but it's very practical and useful, and it's about doing the work instead of understanding a better way to do the work. On top of that skill training, there's field experience and just getting the experience of doing it in real time. Instead of just reading about hitting a baseball, it's going and having to hit a baseball actually in the game. And those are dramatically different things. And then finally, one mode that's useful in this area is shadowing. So you can go along with somebody that's doing, an expert who is doing this and learn how they approach it. For the third horizon of what you know you don't know, that's where book learning and some introductory training. Introductory training is more about what is this whole area? How do you think about it? They're not really getting into doing anything. It's more just preparing you to understand what the environment is that you're going to be operating in. So book learning and introductory training are useful there. And then for the last horizon, there is just getting exposure and exploring. This is where you set off a half day to go to a conference that may or may not be related to what you usually do. And it's just designed to get you thinking and get you seeing things that you wouldn't see otherwise, get you out of the office. Across all of these four horizons, the coaching and peer learning is valuable. It can be helpful from the closest horizon of what you know, because you can have an expert that is helping you think about things in a different way or be a sounding board on really hard parts of the job that you're doing. And then on the exposure and exploring, you can hear about other ways that other people are thinking about things or other areas, interests that they have. So that's the whole personal growth model. If I'm advising a future leader who is just stepping into a management level position, those are the things that I think they need to be aware of as they take control of, and if I'm talking to the leaders, as you take control of your career. So those are the frameworks. There's a career map. If you're working with a future leader, there's the personal development model. If you're a future leader and want to think about how to develop yourself, let's talk about what a high potential development program should look like and some advice around that. On the left-hand side are three recommendations that I have. The first one is don't take a program lightly. These are sophisticated people who are going to look for commitment from the company and know that they're important in the company. And so when you do something, do it planning that it's going to be a year or 2 years or 3 years and that you're really making a commitment to it. I almost think that it would be better not to do anything than to do something that's just a flash in the pan. You can pace things, so you could have, say, you could give high potentials coaching every other month and stretch it out instead of twice a month. So you can use pacing within the program to stretch out your commitment and get more bang for the buck. But I definitely think that consistency and a longer commitment is better. Um, this is an opportunity to let future leaders demonstrate leadership potential. And so give them ownership of how to design the program, ask them what they think is important, and importantly, let them make mistakes on this. This is not a critical part of the company. It's something they can take ownership with. So if they make a mistake or they screw up or they learn, this is a great area for them to do it on. And then the last thing is there are many people that learn in different ways. So include different development modes, sometimes group, sometimes one-on-one, peer or expert, training classes or coaching. They'll gravitate to the ones that they like best, and not everyone will gravitate to the same ones. And so you just have to offer that flexibility in developing the programs. So then on the right side, what are the actual tools or programs that you have to work with? I mentioned before shadowing. This is where you kind of assign an extra person to a task that doesn't really need to be doing it, but instead just watches as it's done. If you haven't done the business case to understand why this is important, then that is simply extra cost. It's like assigning two people to do the job that only one person needs to do. No one would make that decision in a short-term perspective, but it can be highly effective in training high potentials. And so that cost a lot of times is worth bearing. You can also then give them assignments based on projects or a special project or a team working group that you have where they can take a leadership role, and it's not in the core of the business. You can give people tours of duty. I've had a couple of clients assign people overseas into Europe and to give them an opportunity to go into a different office in a different environment and then come back. So that can work really well. You can do tours of duty in different functional areas. It's really hard to go from, say, software development into finance. But if you're working in that complementary or adjacent space, those are really the tours of duty and assigning somebody for 6 months to do something that's adjacent can be really effective with a plan that they come back into their core team after that. Of course, you want to have training programs. And again, there are three types. There's the introductory, skills, and then expert. Those all play a different role. There's self-directed learning, which high potentials a lot of times will do on their own. So that's usually a piece of the pie no matter what. But you can offer some resources and do some research to direct them to some places if you want. Coaching and mentoring is valuable, and peer learning, both of those I think are important parts of future leader development, because so much of it is them learning how to apply skills that they're learning in their situation. And the only way you can get to that is through coaching and mentoring them and having discussion about how they're doing that and letting them learn through the experience that they have. I will say in the work that I've done with my clients in the coaching and peer learning programs that we've put together, those have been the ones that the clients have said, that the future leaders have said are most helpful, because it's like just-in-time learning. It's relevant to what they're working on right there, and they see how a better decision is made, and they learn things while they're doing it. All right, so there's two final points before I want to get to some questions. And these are points that I would make to future leaders, things that they need to be aware of as they think about their careers. So the first is it has to be a win-win between what the future leader gets out of it and what the company gets out of it. If I have seen a number of requests for coverage of MBA classes and other graduate degree work where it's not really clear what the company is going to get out of it, how it's going to improve the work of the person in the job that they currently have. It certainly is going to improve the marketability of the employee, but it's too much of a stretch to say that it's going to help them in their current job. And in those situations, it's challenging. It's a challenging discussion with a future leader to say, we need to see a clearer return on this for it to make sense for us to do. We're interested in your development. We like the idea of you getting training, but this one that you've chosen is just not going to improve your performance in the business fast enough, because we don't have time to wait for you to get an MBA and then be a better leader 5 years from now. So that's the first, is it has to be win-win. The second is we live in a great world where now, if it's really important to you to take off at 4 o'clock and go to a development class or spend time with family, that there are opportunities and options to do that. It's also a wonderful world where there's amazing wealth that you can get and reward that you can get from your work because of the broad impact that you have. You can make a significant amount of money. The problem is when people think that they can leave work at 4 o'clock and get higher rewards. In general, except for 1 or 2% of the population that gets lucky, in general, higher rewards are going to come from higher work, and lower work is going to result in lower rewards. And so it's important that future leaders understand that they can choose a softly rising trajectory or a moderate rising trajectory or a steep rising trajectory, but with each of those comes a different profile of what their effort and what their work needs to look like. And as leaders, as current leaders of a business, we should offer the flexibility that they can have any of those as long as they're performing to the levels we need them to. But it's unreasonable for anybody to expect that they're going to have the benefits of a high trajectory career with just the effort that's required from a low trajectory career. So those are, and I have seen these dynamics play out. Future leaders not looking for the win-win, or future leaders having an unreasonable expectation of what their effort is going to, what kind of rewards they're going to get from their effort. And so I think both of those are important. I think from there, yeah, we go to Q&A. All right, so Phil, do we have any questions?
Well, let's take a look. I think from a, well, let me go ahead and get this started here. From one of the questions that came up, how detailed should the management be in terms of the career path? I think you had maybe 12 different roles identified in the actual function. Does it have to be that detailed so that you're identifying, say, all 12? And so what's that difference between, obviously you'd want to have some flexibility in terms of that role. Any guidance on that point?
Right. I think that was just showing the full complexity of the model. The best answer to that is however detailed the future leader wants it to be or cares about it being. There's probably a certain baseline level. I'd want to identify the next 5 steps, probably. Like, where do you see yourself going? Are you more interested in going horizontally? Are you more interested in going vertically? And then as a boss, if I have an opinion about where I think the greater need is or where I think there's a better opportunity for them, then I'd want to show that. So I'd say probably the first 5 steps should be identified, but then after that, some people may want to see how that could progress and be interested in that, and other people just may not care.
Another question, in terms of the, I guess how, maybe this is more, I don't want to call it higher level question, but from how obvious should it be to the high potential that you're putting them in a role that's been tested? An example that could be used is that I've heard from other people that have been later in their careers that had spent time, say, in large organizations where it's clear after the fact that they were being tested in a certain role, but it wasn't obvious to them at that point, and it was part of the learning, which is that I as your mentor or boss or however you would want to define that, have put them in that role. And it was maybe not a sink or swim sort of situation, but it wasn't clear that they were being tested, as opposed to what you've kind of laid out here, which is that you're being presumably very upfront and deliberate about that.
Yeah. So this probably ties to what kind of company culture you want, and also what kind of leadership style you want. So my leadership style and my culture is very open and being explicit and transparent about this. But I see the value in not telling them. It's like what a similar principle that I have is everybody deserves what they're able to ask for. So if you can put together a business case that shows that you should have a $5,000 raise, then you deserve that $5,000 raise. If you come in and you ask for a $5,000 raise, but you can't put together the business case that shows me that you deserve it, then I could put that business case together for you. Like there are some people that deserve a $5,000 raise, and I could envision how I could put the business plan together to do that. But there's a certain level where you rise up to in an organization where it's really up to you to be able to put that story together. And maybe that's that stacks thing where you have the blue and then the green. Part of the green is being able to frame those things up in a way that you earn them. And so that's not the same thing, but it's a similar thing to say, like, I'm going to try you and I'm going to see what you can do on your own, and I'm not just going to hand it to you on a platter. So I think that's a really useful clarification.
In terms of and maybe kind of go back on the career path component, is that a tool that you think is that something that should be reserved specifically for the high potentials, or is it something that could be used for, I don't want to call them low potentials, but other folks that are within the organization? Is there a value in at least trying to utilize that tool?
I like that. Probably everybody wants a career path. As I envision the career map tool here, it involves actually going out into other parts of the organization. But in some ways, jobs are a fractal. That same kind of core, adjacent, complementary, supplementary can happen at a much smaller level too. And so I would probably get rid of supplementary and focus it in on like core and adjacent, or core, adjacent, and complementary, and probably take away strategy and use a smaller map, because maybe that's what high potential means, is that there's a bigger space that you can go into. And so for lower potential people, there's just a smaller space and you shrink it up.
Okay. Let me look through here. I think as we sort of wrap up here, and obviously want to be mindful of everyone's time, I do want to thank Dave for his time and attention and putting together this material for us, obviously, as well. And the only piece I'll just add as we kind of close things out is to sort of watch this space. We've got some plans in the works to really focus and grow, grow SPARK.grow into a larger ongoing series, because we think it's really important that we try and bring this type of thinking and this type of approach to the work that we're doing to companies in sort of the greater Ann Arbor area and broader in Michigan. So thanks everyone for your time. Thanks, Dave, for your time. And we will see you in the future.
A recording.
Yes, absolutely. There will be a recording for this that will go out to everyone as part of the follow-up. So be on the lookout for that. And thanks everyone enjoy the rest of your day.